In this video, I will be discussing and performing the Prelude in C minor by Louis Couperin. Since I think it is helpful to be familiar with the piece before discussing it, this video will be structured as follows. First, you will watch me perform the piece. Then I will offer suggestions on how to approach it in terms of interpretation. And finally, I will perform the piece once more, but this time the performance will be accompanied by the score. I should mention that the two performances you will hear are different because I use different equipment for video and audio recordings. However, they're going to be fairly similar since I recorded them on the same evening. Let's start with the performance. I have chosen to present this prelude because I find it one of the more straightforward of Louis Couperin's unmeasured preludes. This is because it is mostly made up of a small number of similar motives or gestures, and thus it can serve as a good place to start exploring the genre of unmeasured preludes. There are two main sources for Louis Couperin's music: the Brun manuscript, which contains 133 of his pieces and now belongs to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, and the Parville manuscript, which contains 56 of his pieces and now belongs to the Berkeley Music Library at the University of California. The majority of the pieces in the Parville manuscript are also found in the Brun manuscript, although in Parville they are usually more ornamented. However, Parville also contains a couple of pieces not found in Brun, and this C minor prelude is one of those pieces. In other words, it survives in a single source. I have three modern editions of this prelude. The first is arguably the best known comprehensive edition of Louis Couperin's works, published by L'Oiseau Lyre and edited by David Moroni. I should mention that while this edition commences with the majority of unmeasured preludes, this particular one is found towards the end of the book and assigned the number 128. This is because Moroni's edition is a revision and expansion of the older L'Oiseau Lyre edition by Thurston Dart, which in turn is a revision of the very first edition by Paul Prelude. And Dart's edition is based exclusively on the Brun manuscript, since the Parville manuscript would only be discovered in 1968. The second edition is by Colin Tilney. This is a 3-volume publication entitled The Art of the Unmeasured Prelude, and presents the entire repertory of unmeasured preludes. The first volume reproduces the preludes from their original sources. The second volume is a modern edition of all the preludes, and the third volume contains written commentary regarding performance, editorial decisions, etc. The third edition is by Alan Curtis, which is based on the Parville manuscript. While it is not as comprehensive as Moroni, it is nevertheless invaluable because it includes pieces by anonymous composers which are not included in Moroni's edition. Plus, this way we have the more ornamented readings of the Parville. Now, let me give you a concrete example of why it can be useful to consult multiple editions and, if possible, the original source. I'll show you the original manuscript, and I want to concentrate on the opening chords. One thing that, as modern musicians, we have to get used to when looking at 17th century scores is that all clefs are movable. In our example, the clef for the right hand is a C clef placed so that the bottom line of the staff denotes middle C. For the left hand, the F clef is placed so that the F below middle C is written in the middle line of the staff. Now we can see that the first chords for both hands are C minor triads. In other words, these two. Then there is another C minor triad in the left hand, but then in the right hand there is a little surprise, as it seems we'll get another C minor triad, but the final note is an F instead of a G. The reason I discussed the opening sonorities in so much detail is that only one of the three modern editions I mentioned above presents them exactly as they appear in the manuscript, and that is the Alan Curtis edition. Both Moroni and Tilney replace the final F with a G, so that the piece begins with 4 C minor triads, followed by a C minor scalar ascent. Let me demonstrate both of the versions right now. So what appears in the manuscript is this. And what Moroni and Tilney do when they replace the F with a G, then the piece sounds like this. And you notice that because this change really alters the harmonic content of that moment, I actually played it very differently. I cannot play those chords the same way when the final note is different. Now, you could argue that there is a logic to this decision to replace the F with a G, since there are other unmeasured preludes that start with several arpeggiations of the tonic chord. Furthermore, this particular prelude also concludes with C minor arpeggiations, so there is a certain symmetry between the opening and closing chords. However, it is also true that Louis Couperin's music is full of harmonic wrinkles, and I'm not convinced that the F is somehow an error. Arguably, there's a certain melodic contour that leads stepwise from G to F to E flat. And the following C minor scalar ascent acquires more urgency when it is preceded by this little harmonic disruption. In my performances, I follow the manuscript and play an F. But I hope this demonstrates the value of consulting multiple editions if possible. To be fair, such changes or corrections are usually discussed in the critical commentary of an edition. but if there is no indication in the score to alert the performer that something has been altered, then such changes may go unnoticed. As I mentioned before, for the most part, this prelude is made up of a small number of musical ideas or gestures, and I think that being able to identify them and play them in a manner that gives them a recognizable identity can lend coherence to performance. Of course, I'm not suggesting that a specific gesture has to be played exactly the same way when it reappears, nor am I suggesting that there is only one way to perform a particular gesture. I simply want to offer a few guidelines on how to navigate through the piece. So in a minute, we will turn back to the score. I will be using the Alan Curtis edition, and since I can't show the entire score at once, I will let you know which portion of the score you're looking at. Since there are no bar lines in this music, I will simply refer to the lines of the score by number. There are 5 lines total. Let's look at the first 3 lines of music. As you can tell, I am highlighting specific gestures with a specific color. The first gesture appears in green in lines 1 and 2. I have included an arrow because both are preceded by an ascending scalar passage, but the number of notes in the 2 passages is not identical, hence the arrow. I would suggest that when we have scalar passages, we can shape them and give them a sense of direction. And one way we can do that is by starting a little more slowly and gradually speeding up as we get to the end of the passage. So for example, the first of those 2 scalar passages. Since the second scalar passage is preceded by a short descent, I would differentiate between the 2. In other words, so what I'm doing is that I'm keeping the gestures separate. Think of it as enunciating individual words, or sometimes syllables, as you speak. The 2 descending scalar patterns with an orange arrow are not exactly identical, hence just the arrow, but to me they seem to allude to some sort of imitating writing, so at least in my mind, I consider them similar enough to group them together. As with the previous gestures, I differentiate them from what follows. The 2 blue gestures are identical, so I play them in a very similar way because I want them to have their own distinctive shape. Let's switch now to lines 2, 3, and 4 in the score. First, there are 2 gestures colored in pink and another gesture in pink brackets. I regard all 3 as slight variants of the same motivic idea, with the one in brackets a little less obviously so because the last note is not approached from the note above it. So here's the first one. The second one. And the third one in brackets. Next, the 2 gestures in olive green appear so close to each other that they imply a form of imitating writing. And if you play it along with everything else around it, finally, I'm going to switch the score once more and show lines 3, 4, and 5. Here we see another motivic idea in purple, and personally what I like to do is keep the 3 ascending notes distinct, which also helps accommodate the leap between them. And if you put it together with what's happening around it, I hope this provides you with a clearer idea of how the piece is put together. As I mentioned before, the reason for the presentation is not so much because I want you to think of these gestures as fixed entities that have to be performed in a particular way, but rather to suggest means of navigating through the piece and deciding how to render its musical ideas in a way that highlights their individual identity. So now you're going to listen to the piece again, this time accompanied by the score. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance.